November 14th, 1943. The bitter wind cut through the trenches like 1,000 invisible knives, carrying with it the scent of smoke, mud, and fear. Captain Reinhardt barked orders over the chaos, but his voice barely carried through the roar of distant artillery. The battalion was trapped, hemmed in by enemy forces on three sides, and supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. Men huddled together for warmth, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. Each heartbeat a reminder of how close they were to annihilation. Among them, a figure crouched slightly apart, his hands smeared with the grime of farm soil rather than the polished polish of military life. Heinrich, a farmhand turned reluctant soldier, scanned the frozen landscape with a sharp, calculating gaze. Where others saw chaos, he noticed patterns, the way enemy patrols shifted like clockwork. The gaps between their lines, the slight rise of the terrain that could hide movement. He had spent a lifetime reading the land, coaxing crops from it, anticipating the moods of weather and soil. Now that knowledge could save lives or doom them all. His comrades passed him by, muttering about hopelessness, their fear palpable, their eyes darting at shadows that weren't even there. Even the officers dismissed his observations, too bound by protocol to consider the insights of a simple farmhand. Yet Heinrich's mind raced, weaving possibilities, imagining maneuvers the generals would never risk if he could act. If he could convince them or act alone, there might be a chance. A sliver of hope glimmered, fragile as frost on the morning fields. But taking that chance meant stepping into the enemy's gaze, risking everything. And Heinrich knew, in the marrow of his bones, that failure would mean death for not just him, but for every man in that battered battalion. Somewhere, beyond the trees and the smoke, the enemy waited, and Heinrich had a plan that could change everything. But would courage be enough to turn it into survival? The night after the battalion was trapped stretched like a suffocating blanket over the frozen landscape. Snow fell intermittently, wet and heavy, sticking to uniforms, weighing down rifles, and chilling the men to the bone. Every gust of wind sounded like the wailing of the dead, and the distant thunder of artillery seemed closer with each passing hour. Soldiers huddled in shallow foxholes, their faces pale, their hands trembling, not just from cold, but from the constant dread that each shadow could be a bullet, a grenade, or a patrol creeping closer than they dared imagine. Captain Reinhardt stood over a crude map, scrawled in pencil and water-stained from the relentless snow. He argued with his lieutenants, voices rising over the wind. "We can hold here for 2 more hours, maybe 3, before they flank us," he shouted. "If we retreat now, we'll be slaughtered in the open." Lieutenant Bauer shook his head, teeth chattering. "Captain, supplies are gone. Ammo is nearly at 0. Our men are frozen, exhausted. We can't fight a war under these conditions. Retreat may be our only option." The officer's words rang hollow, echoing through the trenches where men silently prayed for any glimmer of hope. Fear had seeped into the hearts of every soldier. The thought of dying, not in a glorious charge but slowly, surrounded and outmaneuvered, gnawed at them relentlessly. Heinrich, the farmhand turned reluctant soldier, crouched at the edge of the trench, observing the enemy positions with the patience of a man who had spent years reading the land. He noted subtle patterns, the way the enemy patrols rotated, the uneven spacing between their sentries, the slight hesitation when crossing the frozen stream to the north. These weren't obvious mistakes to the trained, they were invisible to most, but to Heinrich they were opportunities. His fingers brushed the worn hilt of his knife as he imagined ways to exploit these gaps, ways to lead his men out of the deadly snare that surrounded them. Heinrich wasn't alone in his observations. Near him, Matthias, a childhood friend from the farm, shivered violently but refused to speak, knowing the men needed silence more than words. "You're still thinking too small," Matthias whispered when Heinrich leaned close. "These men, the officers, they'll never follow your plans unless you prove it works." Heinrich's jaw tightened. He knew Matthias was right. Authority rested in brass, not brains, and yet if he waited for orders it would be too late. The enemy's encirclement tightened with each passing hour. In another trench, Sergeant Vogel, a burly man with scars from a dozen skirmishes, cursed the cold under his breath. He glanced at Heinrich with suspicion. Farm boy thinks he can outsmart a trained army, huh? We'll see how clever he is when we're all frozen solid or shot before dawn. Heinrich ignored him, scanning the enemy lines again. One particular ridge caught his attention. Slight rise in the snow-covered earth that allowed a single man to observe the enemy without being detected. If he could reach it, even for a short time, he could map their patrol routes, identify weak points, and plan a way to move the battalion without being caught in a deadly crossfire. The night was punctuated with bursts of distant gunfire and the occasional flare, painting the landscape in ghostly whites and oranges. Each flash illuminated the terror etched on soldiers' faces, the frozen mud clinging to their boots and the desperation in their eyes. Captain Reinhardt paced, muttering calculations under his breath, oblivious to the subtle opportunities Henrik had identified. If only we had more men, more ammo. Hell, more hope, he muttered as the hours dragged on. Heinrich slipped quietly from the trench, moving like a shadow over the frozen fields. He avoided the main paths, sticking to the slight dips and hollows in the terrain. Snow muffled his footsteps, yet the crunch beneath his boots reminded him that danger was always close. Every rustle of a branch, every distant shout from enemy patrols, sent a surge of adrenaline through him. He reached the ridge and peered over it, eyes scanning the enemy lines with precision. Patrols shifted, sometimes pausing for minutes at a time, unaware that someone was watching. He traced routes they would inevitably take if they pressed their encirclement further. He noted areas where cover was thin, where they could be misled, and even small natural traps he could turn to the battalion's advantage, returning to the trench before dawn. Heinrich shared only fragments of his findings with Matthias. If we move at first light, follow my lead, we can get through the eastern gap. They won't expect it. But one wrong step. His voice trailed off, the implication hanging heavy in the cold air. Matthias nodded grimly, knowing the risk was enormous. Inside the trench, officers continued to argue, unaware of the silent calculations that might save them all. Tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and every man felt the weight of impending doom pressing closer with each frozen breath. Yet somewhere in the shadowed corners of fear and despair, a spark of hope persisted, a plan, fragile but brilliant, lying in the hands of a farmhand who understood the land better than any general understood war. As the first light of dawn tinted the sky with pale gold, Heinrich crouched, staring toward the enemy lines. The battalion's survival rested on one man's knowledge, one man's courage, and the coming hours would demand more than anyone could imagine. And as the snow continued to fall, silent and relentless, the enemy remained unaware that their carefully laid trap was about to be turned against them. The farmhand's plan was ready, but the world around him was poised on the edge of disaster. One false move, one miscalculation, and everything would be lost. And yet, in the cold, frozen fields of uncertainty, Heinrich knew that sometimes ordinary men could do extraordinary things. The question now wasn't whether he could act, it was whether the battalion would live long enough to follow. The morning frost clung stubbornly to the battalion's uniforms, crunching under every hesitant step. Heinrich crouched near the edge of a frozen stream, watching the enemy's patrols cross and recross the white expanse. Each movement, each hesitation was a language only he seemed able to read. Years of working the land had taught him patience, observation, and the subtle art of reading the earth itself. Now, those lessons were his lifeline. He thought back to the farm, the plow turning stubborn soil, the irrigation channels he'd built to guide water where it was needed, the hidden paths through the woods he knew like the back of his hand. If a simple furrow could redirect water, if a small ridge could shield a crop from frost, then surely he could use the terrain to redirect men, mislead enemies, and protect his battalion. His mind raced through possibilities, frozen streams that could be crossed silently, thickets that could hide movement, shallow depressions that could act as traps. Heinrich tested his ideas quietly, first by sending a single messenger Matthias through a narrow path to see if enemy patrols reacted. The patrols shifted slightly, confused by the unexpected movement, giving Heinrich a spark of hope. He marked routes in his mind, imagining the battalion moving as he directed, as if the land itself were guiding them. But with each small victory came new dangers. One misstep could expose them, one poorly timed move could invite disaster. When Heinrich presented his observations to Lieutenant Bauer, the skepticism was palpable. "A farmhand thinks he can outmaneuver trained soldiers in the field?" Bauer said, voice low but sharp. "We are professionals. This is reckless." Heinrich met his gaze steadily. "I'm not suggesting we charge blindly. I'm suggesting we use what we have: terrain, observation, timing to our advantage. There's a way through that won't cost lives." Bauer shook his head, frustration etched in every line of his face. "I've seen men die following half-formed plans. You're not a soldier, Heinrich. This isn't a game." But Heinrich had already begun. Using sticks and stones, he mapped out small diversions, mimicking enemy patrol patterns. He watched as the enemy reacted predictably to subtle changes in the terrain: footsteps where they expected none, noises where there should be silence. Each observation fed into his plan, refining it, sharpening it. The more he experimented, the more he realized that the enemy's confidence was their greatest weakness. They assumed the battalion was trapped, static, and desperate. They didn't account for ingenuity born from a lifetime of surviving in nature. As the day wore on, Heinrich tested small traps, logs arranged to block sight lines, shallow ditches to hide movement, even a carefully positioned snowbank to muffle footsteps. Each success, however minor, boosted the morale of the men who caught glimpses of what he was attempting. Matthias watched him, wide-eyed but trusting, moving with him through the frozen landscape, learning to read it the way Heinrich did. Not all reactions were positive. Captain Reinhardt, passing by, frowned at the improvised markers and whispered strategies Heinrich had left in the snow. "What is he doing out here? Playing at being a scout?" he muttered to himself. Suspicion hung in the air like smoke. Officers whispered among themselves, wondering if the farmhand's audacity would cost them dearly. Heinrich, aware of their judgment, felt the weight of their doubt pressing down, but he could not afford hesitation. The battalion's survival depended on acting now. While the enemy was vulnerable to manipulation. By afternoon, Heinrich's plan began to take shape in its entirety. He had identified a narrow ridge that could act as a hidden path, a frozen stream that could be crossed silently to flank the enemy, and a series of small depressions that would allow the battalion to regroup if caught in a skirmish. He imagined coordinating movements with barely audible signals: a flick of a branch, a whistle in the wind, a snow-covered marker that only his comrades would recognize. The first test came unexpectedly. A lone enemy scout moved into the area Heinrich had marked as a diversion. Heinrich held his breath, watching as the man followed the false trail, oblivious to the farmhand's hidden position. When the scout disappeared behind a thicket, Heinrich allowed himself a small, cautious smile. It worked. The enemy was predictable, and with careful guidance, the battalion could exploit that predictability, but danger was never far. A sudden crack of a branch snapped Heinrich's head up, eyes darting to see another patrol moving closer than anticipated. For a tense moment he considered retreating, but then he remembered the men waiting in the trenches, his comrades who trusted him, even without fully understanding why. One false move could expose them all, but hesitation could be just as deadly. He signaled Matthias to take a safer path back, while he remained to adjust a diversion, his pulse thrumming like a war drum in his chest, even as officers continued to question his methods. Heinrich's confidence in his own understanding of the land grew. He wasn't a soldier, they said, but neither were they equipped to see what the terrain revealed: the weaknesses in the enemy's movements, the subtle patterns that could be turned to their advantage. He realized that ingenuity, patience, and courage could outweigh rank and training if applied with precision. As dusk approached, Heinrich retreated to a shallow hollow near the trench, mentally walking through the plan in its entirety. The battalion would move under cover of early morning light, following the routes he had mapped, using diversions and terrain to mislead the enemy. It was a delicate balance of timing, stealth, and courage, but he believed it could succeed. The officer's doubts remained. The threat of annihilation loomed, and the cold pressed relentlessly against the soldiers' bodies. Yet, for the first time since the battalion had been trapped, Heinrich allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. If the plan worked, if his understanding of the land could guide them, they might survive. But one misstep, one miscalculation, and the frozen fields could become a graveyard. Heinrich gazed across the snow-blanketed landscape, the ridge he had chosen for the first move catching the last rays of sunlight. Tomorrow, the battalion's fate would rest on his plan, on his courage, and on the silent language of the land that he alone seemed able to read. And as night fell, the threat of discovery lingered in every shadow, a constant reminder that the line between survival and death had never been thinner. The plan had taken shape, but the battlefield was watching, waiting and ready to punish even the smallest mistake. Heinrich knew that tomorrow would demand more than cleverness. It would demand absolute resolve. And the question that haunted him as darkness fell was simple yet terrifying. Would the farmhand's knowledge of the land be enough to save them all? The pre-dawn darkness wrapped the battlefield in a heavy, suffocating blanket. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, yet every movement, every shadow seemed amplified in the frozen stillness. Heinrich crouched low behind a ridge, the bitter wind cutting through his coat and chilling him to the bone. His breath came in sharp, visible bursts, but he did not dare make a sound. Around him, the battalion lay frozen in their trenches, waiting, watching, unaware that their survival would soon depend entirely on the courage and cunning of a single farmhand. Heinrich's plan demanded he venture closer to the enemy than anyone else dared. He moved with the careful precision of a man who had spent years reading the subtle cues of the land, the way snow settled in footprints, the faint sway of tree branches under the wind, the soft gurgle of a hidden stream beneath a thin layer of ice. Each element could betray him or serve as his ally. He carried only what he needed, a small pack of ropes, stones, and a few makeshift markers designed to mislead enemy patrols. The first objective was simple in theory: set up diversions along the ridgeline to create the illusion of movement, convincing enemy scouts that the battalion was still trapped in place. Heinrich carefully positioned small snow-covered branches and rocks in patterns that mimicked troop movement. He paused often, listening to the distant crunch of enemy boots in the snow, forcing himself to remain perfectly still even as adrenaline throbbed in his temples. A single slip, a misstep, and he would be discovered, his plan, and the lives of dozens of men lost in an instant. A patrol passed dangerously close. Heinrich's heart hammered against his ribs. He flattened himself against the ridge, willing his body to become part of the frozen earth. The soldiers passed without noticing him, boots crunching just inches away. Every detail mattered. The tilt of a tree, the reflection of early morning light on a patch of ice, the echo of distant voices. When the patrol finally disappeared into the mist, Heinrich allowed himself the smallest of breaths. Careful not to disturb the fragile silence he depended on, he moved to the second objective, a shallow hollow that could serve as a concealed observation point. From there, he could monitor enemy movements while signaling back to Matthias and the other trusted comrades in the trenches. Heinrich noted the changing patterns of patrols, the points where the enemy's vigilance faltered. Each observation fed into his larger plan, allowing him to anticipate movements that might otherwise have trapped the battalion, but danger escalated quickly. As he adjusted a snow-covered branch to create a diversion, a shout rang out behind him. Heinrich froze, realizing that a second patrol had spotted a disturbance he had not yet covered. The men were moving toward him, weapons at the ready. He pressed himself flat against the cold ground, heart racing, counting the seconds as though each could mean life or death. The patrol paused, scanning, and Heinrich stayed perfectly still, blending with the frozen landscape. Then, almost impossibly, the soldiers turned and moved away, leaving him trembling but alive. By midday, Heinrich's movements had become a carefully choreographed dance. He placed traps to slow any enemy advance, misdirected patrols into dead ends, and even rigged small disturbances that suggested phantom movements across the snowy terrain. Each small success brought confidence, but also the realization that a single error could undo everything. The battalion remained oblivious to his efforts, watching shadows and whispers of movement, puzzled by minor inconsistencies that hinted at something larger. Strange occurrences, footprints where there should have been none, Distant noises that seemed to come from nowhere kept the men on edge, unknowingly reinforcing the credibility of Heinrich's manipulations. Tension was at its peak when Heinrich spotted a small squad of enemy soldiers moving toward a narrow pass he had intended to use for the battalion's first maneuver. Their proximity was closer than anticipated, and the risk of exposure intensified. He adjusted a shallow trench he had dug, covering it with snow and leaves, creating a subtle trip mechanism that would alert his men while delaying the enemy. Every action had to be precise. Any miscalculation could spell disaster. Meanwhile, whispers began circulating through the trenches. Soldiers murmured about shadows that moved too deliberately, about faint sounds in the snow that didn't match enemy activity. Some felt it was luck, others imagined ghosts of the battlefield, but Heinrich knew it was the first sign of the clever maneuver he was preparing. Even skeptical officers could not deny the unusual patterns that seemed to disrupt enemy behavior. As evening approached, Heinrich returned to his concealed position near the battalion's trench, exhausted but resolute. His traps were in place, diversions created, and observation complete. He shared only minimal details with Matthias, careful to avoid revealing anything that could compromise the plan. "Tomorrow," he whispered, voice tight with anticipation, "we move. If this works, the battalion will have a way out. If not—" He did not finish the thought. Letting the frozen silence convey the gravity of their situation, the night settled over the battlefield, blanketing everything in an eerie quiet. Yet beneath that quiet, tension thrummed like a living thing. Heinrich lay still, listening to the distant shouts and the occasional crack of ice under patrol boots, knowing that each passing hour brought them closer to the moment where the plan would be tested. The farmhand's ingenuity had set the stage, but the true test was still to come. The enemy's vigilance was relentless, danger lurked in every shadow, and the battalion's survival hung by the thinnest of threads. Heinrich's mind replayed every step, every diversion, every hidden trap. One wrong move could unravel everything. And as he closed his eyes for a brief, restless rest, the question lingered in the icy air. Would the farmhand's plan succeed, or would the frozen battlefield claim them all before dawn? The first light of dawn bled pale gold over the snow-covered battlefield, glinting on the frozen edges of the ridge Heinrich had chosen for the battalion's escape. The air was still, deceptively calm, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Every soldier in the trenches waited tensely, their eyes scanning the horizon, muscles coiled for movement. Heinrich moved silently along the narrow path he had marked, signaling with subtle flicks of a branch to indicate the sequence of maneuvers. Every step had been rehearsed in his mind, every hazard accounted for, but the margin for error was razor-thin. The plan began with diversionary signals. Heinrich triggered a series of subtle disturbances. Snow-covered rocks shifted, small branches snapped, and hidden footprints suggested troop movements where none existed. From the enemy lines, figures moved toward these false trails, the soldiers reacting exactly as Heinrich had anticipated. Their confusion was immediate. Patrols doubled back on themselves, formations broke, and radio calls crackled with uncertain commands. The enemy believed the battalion was pinned in place, yet in truth, Heinrich's men were already beginning their silent advance along the ridge. Sheltered by snowbanks and depressions he had identified the day before, Matthias and a handful of trusted soldiers followed Heinrich's lead, moving like shadows along the frozen terrain. Each man knew that hesitation could mean death. The farmhand's intimate knowledge of the land guided them, a hidden hollow that masked their passage, a narrow creek that muffled their footsteps, a snow-laden thicket that concealed their movement from distant eyes. Every obstacle had been considered, yet danger still lurked in every step. The enemy, increasingly frantic, began making critical mistakes. Patrols collided in confusion, crossing paths they should have avoided. One squad, believing they had discovered the battalion's flank, moved into a trap Heinrich had prepared, a shallow depression covered in snow that caused men to stumble, buying precious seconds. Explosions from small sabotage devices placed strategically earlier shook the nearby area, reinforcing the illusion of a larger force moving through the terrain. The enemy's cohesion unraveled. Exactly as Heinrich had envisioned. Despite the small victories, the tension was unbearable. Heinrich paused briefly to check the horizon. A machine gun nest, previously overlooked, glinted with menacing barrels aimed toward the ridge. His mind raced, calculating the split-second decisions required to bypass it. He signaled Matthias to create a minor distraction, a rolling snowball set to strike a hollow tree, drawing attention just long enough. The ploy worked. Enemy eyes diverted, rifles momentarily idle, giving the battalion a critical window to pass. Undetected, Heinrich led his men through a series of depressions and wooded patches, each footstep choreographed to minimize sound. The snow muffled their movement, but every crunch of ice underfoot made their hearts pound. For a moment, one soldier slipped, the sharp crack of breaking ice echoing through the morning air. Heinrich's hand shot out instinctively, steadying him. A breath caught in the throats of the men, but no alarm sounded. The battalion pressed on, each man aware that their lives depended on unwavering discipline and trust in Heinrich's judgment. By mid-morning, the battalion had moved far enough to gain a tactical advantage. The enemy, still caught in Heinrich's web of deception, was lured into positions that left them exposed and disorganized. Artillery fire, previously impossible to direct, could now be employed strategically by the officers, thanks to the farmhand's careful manipulation of terrain and enemy perception. Men who had been frozen in fear the night before now moved with cautious determination. Emboldened by the visible effectiveness of Heinrich's plan, the climax came as the battalion approached a final ridge, the last barrier between them and safety. Enemy forces, realizing the deception too late, scrambled to regroup, leaving gaping gaps in their lines. Heinrich led the final push, signaling his men to sprint through a narrow corridor of cover he had identified. Bullets whizzed past, splintering frozen earth and ice, but the farmhand's intimate understanding of the landscape allowed each soldier to find the safest path. Timing was everything. Hesitation could cost lives. Yet each step, each breath, carried them closer to freedom. When the last of the men cleared the ridge, a collective sigh of relief rose over the battalion. They had emerged from near certain annihilation thanks to the audacity and ingenuity of one man. Heinrich, exhausted but resolute, allowed himself a brief glance back at the chaos left behind. Enemy formations in disarray, commanders shouting in frustration, and the landscape itself bearing the subtle signs of his manipulation. The battalion had not only survived, they had gained an advantage that no officer had anticipated. Even as the adrenaline faded, the magnitude of what had just occurred settled over the men. They had trusted a farmhand over protocol, cleverness over brute force, and intuition over training, and it had worked. Officers who had doubted him approached cautiously, their expressions a mixture of respect and disbelief. Sergeant Vogel clapped Heinrich on the shoulder, voice low but filled with admiration. "You did it. By God, you did it." Heinrich did not allow himself to bask in glory. There was no time for celebration. The battle was far from over, and the battalion's safety depended on continuing vigilance. But in that moment, on the ridge bathed in the pale morning light, one truth was undeniable: ordinary knowledge, courage, and cunning could triumph even in the harshest crucible of war. The battalion's fate had turned, not by sheer force, but by the clever maneuver of a farmhand who had understood the land better than any general could. And as they moved onward, battered but alive, Heinrich could feel the weight of his plan's success and the unspoken promise that sometimes the smallest voices and quietest minds could alter the course of history. The morning light stretched across the battlefield like a fragile promise. Snow still clung to the ground, streaked with mud and the remnants of hurried maneuvers. The battalion had emerged from near certain disaster, their numbers intact but shaken, their breaths heavy and uneven. The silence after the storm of movement was almost surreal, punctuated only by the distant calls of regrouping units and the occasional barked order from officers trying to restore order. For the first time in days, the men moved with purpose rather than desperation, their morale slowly rebuilding. Captain Reinhardt surveyed the battalion from a small rise, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. The enemy had been lured into a tangle of confusion, and the battalion had navigated the terrain with astonishing efficiency. He could see it now, every misdirected patrol, every carefully concealed hollow, every frozen depression that had guided the soldiers safely through the snow. His mind, trained for rigid strategy and formal tactics, struggled to reconcile the success with its source. An ordinary farmhand, had orchestrated their survival. The men themselves began to speak in hushed tones about Heinrich's ingenuity. Where skepticism had once dominated, admiration now took root. Matthias grinned, rubbing frostbitten hands together. "Who would have thought a farm boy could outsmart the enemy better than any of us?" he muttered. Other soldiers nodded, their faces reflecting relief, awe, and an unspoken respect for the quiet man who had risked everything. Sergeant Vogel approached Heinrich, his scarred face softened by acknowledgement. "I'll be damned," he said, voice low but sincere. "You saved us all? Don't ever forget that." Yet even in the midst of this small triumph, the toll of the escape was evident. Several soldiers limped, wounded by enemy fire or missteps on the treacherous terrain. One young private sat shivering, clutching a frostbitten hand and staring blankly at the horizon. The reality of war was unforgiving. Every clever maneuver, every daring escape came with personal sacrifice. Heinrich himself bore the strain. His hands were raw from climbing and setting traps, his mind fatigued from constant calculation. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him, and for a fleeting moment, he wondered if the gamble had truly been worth the cost. As the battalion regrouped, subtle reflections began to emerge. Officers acknowledged, grudgingly at first, that rigid adherence to protocol might have doomed them. Heinrich's methods had been unorthodox but effective. The battlefield was littered with evidence of the enemy's confusion, footprints leading nowhere, splintered snow covering hastily abandoned positions, and the empty stares of soldiers who had been caught off guard. The farmhand's understanding of terrain and human behavior had turned what seemed like an impossible situation into an opportunity for advantage. Despite the victories, the shadow of the larger war loomed. The enemy was not vanquished, only momentarily misled. There were still battles to fight, strategies to plan, and countless dangers that the battalion would face before the conflict was over. Heinrich knew this, and while he allowed himself a quiet moment of satisfaction, he remained vigilant. Every soldier carried the memory of what could have happened, what almost did happen, and that knowledge tempered their relief with sober awareness. In a quiet moment near the ridge, Heinrich observed his comrades. Their eyes, once filled with fear, now held determination. They moved with a cautious confidence, inspired by the cleverness that had guided them through the enemy lines. For Heinrich, the reward was not in accolades but in seeing men survive who had once been convinced that death was inevitable. The farmhand had transformed into a figure of quiet leadership, his resourcefulness elevating him above his station. Even if rank would never officially recognize it, the battlefield itself seemed to mirror the shift. Where once there had been chaos and confusion, now there was structure and purpose. The men followed orders more attentively, yet with a newfound willingness to trust ingenuity over blind obedience. Officers who had dismissed Heinrich now observed him carefully, their skepticism slowly giving way to admiration. The dynamic within the battalion had changed. A single individual's insight had ripple effects, reshaping strategy and morale alike. Even amidst the fragile calm, the cost of survival remained clear. Frostbitten fingers, bruised bodies, and haunted eyes served as constant reminders of the risks taken. Every man knew that the farmhand's plan had been a gamble, a razor-thin chance that could have ended in disaster. And yet, the battalion had not only survived, but gained an advantage they would carry into future engagements. As the sun climbed higher, Heinrich allowed himself a deep, steadying breath. The snow sparkled cold and sharp beneath his gaze, a landscape both brutal and beautiful. His mind lingered on the path ahead, further battles, more strategy, more lives depending on decisions made in the heat of fear and the stillness of opportunity. The plan had shifted the tide, but the war was far from over. For now, though, the battalion could move forward with hope instead of despair. They had been given a second chance, a fragile gift carved from ingenuity, courage, and careful observation. Heinrich had proven that even the most unassuming individuals could change the course of events, turning desperation into strategy, fear into opportunity. And as they prepared to advance cautiously toward their next objective, the battalion carried with them the lesson that ordinary men, when armed with wit, courage, and unwavering resolve, could shape extraordinary outcomes. The snow crunched beneath boots, the wind carried whispers of survival, and Heinrich, quiet and observant as ever, knew that the farmhand's cleverness had done more than save lives. It had ignited a spark of resilience that would endure far beyond the frozen fields of that perilous morning. Years later, the fields where Heinrich had once labored under the sun were silent. The only sounds the wind rustling through the golden stalks and the distant hum of a passing train. The farmhand, now older, moved slowly along the familiar rows, hands roughened by work rather than war. His eyes, though calm, held the memory of snow-covered ridges, hidden depressions, and the cold, tense hours when lives had balanced on his decisions. He never spoke of what had happened, never sought recognition. To him, survival had been its own reward. In the villages and small towns near the battalion's former encampments, whispers persisted. Soldiers who had lived to tell the tale recounted the legend of the farmhand who had saved an entire unit from destruction. They described the clever maneuvers, the traps that confounded the enemy, the calm decisiveness in the face of certain death. To them, Heinrich was more than a soldier. He was a symbol of ingenuity, courage, and the extraordinary power of ordinary people. Yet the man himself remained modest, brushing off praise with a quiet smile, returning instead to the rhythm of the farm. Occasionally, a letter would arrive from a former comrade expressing gratitude in measured words. "We owe our lives to you," one wrote, describing how the battalion had managed to regroup, counterattack, and survive because of a single man who saw what others could not. Heinrich read the letters quietly, tucked them away, and continued with his work, planting, tending, harvesting content that his actions had mattered. Even if no medals or public accolades would follow, the seasons turned, and the farm prospered, not because of glory, but because of the steady, deliberate care Heinrich gave to it. Yet every time he glanced at a ridge or traced the path of a stream, memories of those perilous days surfaced. He remembered the fear, the adrenaline, the near misses, and the moment when the battalion had emerged victorious. And he remembered most of all that ordinary people, when willing to act with courage and clarity, could alter the course of events in ways that seemed impossible. In the evenings, as the sun dipped low over the fields, Heinrich sometimes heard the faint echoes of voices, not from the present, but from the past. Veterans who had survived the battalion's ordeal would recount their stories, sharing tales of a farmhand whose knowledge of the land had turned the tide of battle. Children would listen wide-eyed, adults would nod in admiration. And the legend of Heinrich endured not in statues or headlines, but in the quiet, unassuming acknowledgement of lives saved. The farmhand's legacy was simple, yet profound. Heroism does not always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it is found in those who observe, who plan, and who act when the stakes are highest. Courage and cleverness, born of ordinary experience and unshakable resolve, had changed the fate of many that winter. Heinrich never sought fame, yet through his actions, he proved that one person's insight could ripple through history, leaving an indelible mark on those who survived and on the generations that would hear their story for years to come.